Okay, all right.
All right. Hello, everyone. This is, I think we've got a couple of minutes, but just while we're getting warmed up, right? Can you use your little chats can you hear us okay and see us okay? Could you put some messages in the chat to say yes, or can't hear you, or where did you buy your shirt? Any kind of message, really.
Yes.
You can. Okay, that's good. That's good. That's good. All right. All right.
That's great. Okay.
All right. So you're under the impression that it's 6:30, and I'm under the impression I've got a minute. We've got a minute left. Just wait till more people kind of join.
Where did you buy that shirt?
Ah, exactly. Very classy joint called Oxfam. All right. So okay, I think it is 6:30 then. Okay. Cool.
Yeah, it is.
All right. So who are you?
Who am I?
Yeah. Who are you?
Well, I'm Josie Holt, and
what does that mean? Halt, like stop.
No.
You stop things. No.
Mock. I'm Josie Holt.
Yeah.
I'm working with the People's Assembly seeding group to try to help bring People's Assemblies out into the rest of the country and the XR community as a whole. Based in North Devon, where I helped set up a local group up here, and we've been using People's Assemblies from the start. So I've got quite a lot of experience in terms of running and facilitating assemblies. And
do you like it?
Do I like it? Yeah, I love it.
Why? What do you like? Like the attention or what?
I like the attention. No, why do I love it? I love it because through using the assemblies, what we've actually done within the local group that I help to facilitate is we've created a community from the start. So we've created a situation where from the very beginning, every single person that has come to those meetings and that has inputted feels like they are part of how we move forward and what we're kind of co-creating. Yeah. So that's been a beautiful thing. Yeah. Who are you?
My name is Kelsey-Fry. How do you do?
Hi, nice to meet you.
I work with the I do a variety of different stuff with Extinction Rebellion. I came on sort of November the 10th really, but I've been watching what Gail Bradbrook and Roger Hallam have been doing for quite a while, and I am involved in the Extinction Rebellion Internationalist Solidarity Network. So that's working with a lot of Global South grassroots groups, and I wrote this People's Assembly manual, so you can get that online. It's really easy to do, and we're giving out quite a lot of copies of this. So that's who I am. Actually, I'll give a little bit more of a background. Actually, so I first saw that kind of stuff. Right, I first saw assemblies in action in 2005 during the demonstrations against the G8 summit in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and there was a camp. It was an eco camp, it was called, right, just near Stirling, and it was the first time that we had large groups of people coming to agreements very quickly by using hand signals. Okay, I want to make a point, and all this stuff. Anyway, you'll learn about that from Josie later. But I was really impressed by the fact that everyone was included, and the fact that by doing that, everyone owns what the movement's doing. So there was no top down. Everyone do this. Everyone became involved in what we all decide to do. And then I saw it really big time with Occupy. So I happened to live near St Paul's Cathedral in those days. So I saw People's Assemblies really flourish in the Occupy movement. They're amazing. There's something about when someone takes the mic and says, and they look at a big crowd and they go, I've never done anything like this before, but I feel compelled to say. And it's that moment is extraordinary. To me, that's where things can really become powerful. So what I'm getting at is this is an opportunity for people who have no confidence, who don't have a degree in politics or anything, who actually feel moved to speak, feel safe to speak, and they speak viscerally, and the air can crack, as far as my experience, and that's what I saw in Occupy. So that's one of the reasons I became very enthusiastic about this use of participatory democracy. So I'm actually I'm neatly segueing in. Did you notice?
Yeah, I did.
I'm neatly segueing into the history background, the revolutionary background to People's Assemblies, which is really worth knowing. So look, they're just simply ways of large amounts of people coming together and meeting and having well facilitated conversation, dialogue. And that means that, you know, they weren't invented like, you know, 10 minutes ago. Well, they weren't invented in Occupy. They actually they've been the linchpin of revolutionary movements for a long time, particularly in the global south. So, you know, across the revolutionary movements in Latin America, in Mexico, the Zapatistas, for example, you know, that they had at the heart of them participatory democracy, people's assemblies. Yeah. Across Africa, the whole continent of Africa, there's been all these different forms of participatory democracy that have been going on for millennia, really. But particularly in the last 100 years or the last decades, they have been at the heart of revolutionary movements. So, you know, if you move up from the global south and you look at the amazing Indignados movement in Spain. So in 2011, there was what was called the movement of the squares. And that spread right across North Africa, from Tunisia right across to Egypt, Tahrir Square, and they all had these things in common, which was taking public space, taking squares, and then people using participatory democracy so everyone is heard equally. And that was dynamite, famously, with the Arab Revolt, you know, and Tahrir Square, famously in Tunisia, they took down their dictator, and then it spread across to Syntagma Square in Greece. And then it became the main tool for the Occupy movement. So, you know, that started in Zuccotti Park and then spread right across the world. On one Saturday in 2011, there was something like 1,200 Occupy camps across the world. So, you know, it's a tool that's really at the heart of a lot of revolutionary movements. And the reason it's been so powerful and so repeated is because it involves everyone being heard equally. So everyone participates in it, and things, really magical things, can happen. So that's the sort of historical background to it, and it's bringing it up now to the present day. And I think you're going to talk about something, aren't you? Yeah. So that's giving you the sort of revolutionary historical background, folks, and then over to my accomplice here, who is going to talk about what is a PA.
What's a PA? Okay, so a People's Assembly, very, very simply, is a way for a group of people, any people at all, from any background, from any walk of life, anybody at all, to come together and discuss issues or make decisions collectively. So it's a way of people coming into that decision-making process and that discussion process in a situation where all voices are heard and heard equally, and where no voices or one voice or group of voices are allowed to dominate. And this is what makes it different to a lot of the structures and a lot of the systems that we have in place for making decisions, which are often very hierarchical. Yeah, so that's it in a nutshell. It's a way for people to come together to discuss something in a way where all voices are heard, and all voices are heard equally, and no voices are allowed to dominate. That's it in a nutshell.
Okay, so okay, over to me, and
not to be confused.
Not to be confused with citizens' assemblies. All right, so people's assemblies are the sort of this current wave coming out of Extinction Rebellion has people's assemblies as a really major organising tool which is why we're doing this webinar, and which is why this was written. And as you all know, the third demand from Extinction Rebellion is about citizens' assemblies. So let's just make it clear once and for all that they're very different things, apart from the fact they've got the word assembly in them. So citizens' assemblies are, and the citizens' assemblies we are focusing on are ones that use sortition. So they are very specific, and they often cost quite a lot of money. So what they are, citizens' assemblies, is where members of the public are chosen at random, similar to jury service, and they are funded to come together to discuss an issue. All right. It's been used right across the world, and the one that's really famous, which I recommend that if you want to look into more of it, you want to see a film called When Citizens Assemble, done by a bloke called Patrick Chalmers, and it's about the Citizens Assembly in Dublin. And so they randomly chose 100 people from Ireland, and they came together over a series of 14 weekends where they were looking at the issue of abortion. So Ireland had a kind of really archaic anti-abortion law, and so it was discussing changing that law. And so people are chosen at random, just like jury service. And what happens is that the way that it's sort of configured, the randomly chosen people will be a microcosm of that society. So certain amount of women, certain amount of men, young, old, of colour, disability. So it's a perfect microcosm of that particular society. And then they will go through a process of deliberative democracy. What that means is they will be exposed to a whole plethora, a whole field of experts on that issue. And they will be continually exposed to all this different expertise until they have what you may call a 360-degree understanding of an issue. And then they will come to a conclusion. Citizens' assemblies are very useful for issues that governments are too frightened to address because they might lose their electoral background, backing. So, you know, abortion in Ireland, basically no politicians want to discuss that because they risk losing all their voters. So they use the Citizens' Assembly very successfully to change this archaic law. So citizens' assemblies are a very specific process of using randomly chosen people to discuss an issue. People's assemblies, however, is totally different. People's assemblies is basically a large gathering or a small gathering of people where they're able to go through a process where they discuss an issue or they sort of make a decision, and anyone can join. So it's not randomly chosen, doesn't cost any money as far as I know. So it's, you know, very, very different process, but it's important to kind of make sure we're clear about that. Don't mix them up, citizens' assemblies and people's assemblies. Okay, so over to you. Do you want to talk about organising?
I want to talk about how it's used.
You are? Okay.
I'm going to talk about how we use assemblies. I'm also going to say we've got the chat bar running, but we're not going to really be able to keep up with it. But after we have gone through all the different ways that the assemblies can be used and stuff that we're going to skill share around it, then there's going to be a question and answer session at the end. We'll keep the chat bar running, but we're not going to really be able to stop and pick things out of it at this stage, but then there will be a really good session for that at the end. So how is it used? How are people's assemblies used? Well, there's a number of different ways that we can use assemblies, and one of the really main ways that we can use it is organising. So there's different ways that we can use it to organise. So how we've used it locally within our local group, so specifically I'm looking at how we used it in the North Devon group, is when we started the local group, the first thing we did was we gathered everybody together. We said, right, we're going to hold an assembly on how we can, in our local area, feed into the rebellion. So we got everybody together, we explained what an assembly was, and then we used it to generate ideas as an entire group, which then fed into how we actually moved forward as a group, which meant that it wasn't just the few of us that had decided to organise the group standing there saying, right, this is what we're going to do, this is how we organise, these are our structures. It meant that everybody that wanted to be included had a voice and had a place in that creation of how we went forward. So using it as an organisational structure locally, we've used it as a whole group. We've used it to bring people together. We've used it by setting up a public meeting where we said we're going to be in the library or in this open space at this time. Anybody can come along to be part of this discussion. So we've had it as a very open space discussion. We've also used it where we've gathered the whole of the working groups into an assembly and split everybody up into the different working groups that we're using in order to organise within our local group, and held an assembly based on the working groups to feed in so that we all know what different people in different working groups are looking at. So you can use it in the sense of organising as a group. You can use it to discuss particular issues. You can use it to direct where you're going as a group. You can use it as a decision-making tool within a group where you bring people together and say, we need to decide how we're going to structure something. We need to decide whether we're going to do this action or not. So you can use it as a direct decision-making tool. And when you're using it as a decision-making tool, you can have people who present different ideas. So I feel that we should do this, or I feel that we should do that. And then the whole group gets a chance to communicate about that, to discuss that, to have their voices heard, and that can then feed back into the decision that you make as a group. We used it at Marble Arch So you can use it as an organisational tool in terms of holding morning assemblies.
So what that look like? What happened to the Marble Arch organisation?
In the Marble Arch organisations, we held morning assemblies at Marble Arch so that information could be fed into the people that were there, so people could come who were part of that group, who were holding Marble Arch, or come from other sites to that morning assembly. And then people could bring information about different needs, different aspects of what people were doing across the rebellion. So, you know, if there was a particular need for support in a particular area, there was a process by which people could come and actually give information to that assembly. And then there was a process by which the people that were in that assembly could then input into how they could move forward with that, into what might be needed. And using the hand signals and using the facilitation techniques, they were able to come to decisions about what the whole group felt was needed for particular things, or how they were going to move forward with those issues at that time in that, or if that needed to be, you know, dealt with again the next day. So it was used as a way of collectively making decisions about issues that were arising as we were going through the rebellion on a kind of a morning by morning basis.
Yeah, cool. Okay. So that's mainly the organising area.
Yeah,
yeah.
about,
right?
Yeah.
So the other use, another use for assemblies is as Josie's just touched on, is decision making. Okay, so decision making can be as simple as shall we stay or shall we go. So let's say that you're using an assembly and you've blocked a road, a public we've blocked a road, and so shall we stay or shall we go? A section 14 has been issued by the police, for example, which means that if you stay, you're liable to be arrested. So rather than everyone sitting there quickly working out what the hell am I going to do, you can hold an assembly then, facilitate an assembly then, and you can put that out to the assembly. You know, we're going to make this decision together. Shall we stay or shall we go? We'll do a temperature check. So, you know, shall we stay? If you think we should stay, go like this. If you think we should go like this. And you get a temperature check, and you can see instantly where everyone stands on that subject. So there can be very snappy decision-making process that happens. But there's also, you know, more protracted things. Like a good example is in the Occupy London movement, there was an offer from the City of London Corporation. So City of London Corporation owns the land where we were outside St Paul's. And I'm only going on about that one, because that's the one where I was, but there was 43 Camden. But the City of London Corporation said, okay, we're going to tell you this, we'll give you a deal. As long as you promise to go by December 31st, we'll leave you alone. So we ended up having 3 nights of assemblies about that. You know, shall we agree to their demands or what? And at the end of 3 nights of these long deliberations, we decided, no, actually, we will refuse their demands and issue counter demands instead. But it took a long time to get that to the decision process. Now, there's something really important in this, yeah, because there was no one leading it all. The people who were leading it was the assembly itself. Everyone being heard equally, everyone being listened to respectfully. There was no leaders at all. So what that meant was, when we finally came to a decision, which is no, we'll refuse their demands and we're going to issue our own demands and we're going to stay as long as we want. All right. We all owned that decision. And that's one of the things that's really, really powerful about using participatory democracy, because we've all participated in it. That means you literally own that decision. You'll stand by it. You'll live by it, because you know you were involved in it. All right. And that's why this has been such a powerful tool in revolutionary movements, because it's not top down, it's everybody was involved in that decision. And I'll tell you something now that you really need to bear in mind, is what Aristotle said, right? Which is, it is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. And, you know, okay, so that's a swanky Greek, Aristotle, right? But there's a real truth in that, because what's really powerful about participatory democracy is you can come to an assembly knowing, right, we're going to be discussing this issue and this is what I know about this issue. But if you really get into radically listening to everybody, I found 80 to 80% of the time, I would have my mind changed, because none of us know everything. You see, that's what's great about assemblies, is let's celebrate the fact that we are all pretty ignorant, but together we've got a better chance of working out some wisdom, you know, the wisdom of the group, the wisdom of the crowd. And that really paid testament, that because we've been in a lot of assemblies, and a lot of the times you come away going, my God, that was a brilliant decision, but that's because we listened to everybody. And that's a really powerful aspect of it. So, take that decision-making aspect really seriously, because it's a gift. To make decisions like this, it's an absolute gift. The other kinds of decision-making is stuff to do with, like, your local regional movements, like your local regional groups. What issues should we be looking at? What actions should we be taking? In the lead up to the recent International Rebellion in London, there was all these assemblies where groups are already using assemblies. There were these assemblies going, well, who will go to London? Who will work in the back office? So loads of decisions were made about how we can support the International Rebellion, and that's only going to grow. There's a lot of you listening to this now, which is really encouraging to see so many people on the webinar wanting to hear more about this. And when we did this training in Bristol for the Spring Uprising, it was rammed, and it was great. It's really good to see that this culture is growing. But the whole thing about this decision-making process is we all own it, and it's really important to bear that. And it could be simple stuff, by the way. It's not like, really big stuff like shall we stay or shall we go? It could be a decision-making process about how we're going to organise ourselves, or what kind of ways, what kind of sort of behaviour is acceptable and isn't. It's all these like really, really basic stuff, which really, really works. And on that, by the way, on behaviours, and it's in the manual, but I really want to underline this. A lot of this stuff has been written based on experience, and based on the experiences of the Indignados. They've all inputted into this from Spain. The Occupy movement from America have fed into this, and also the revolutionary movements in Latin America have fed into this process. But one thing that's really salient and sticks out is we accept, everyone is included. We accept all people, but we don't accept all behaviours. And we'll talk a bit more about this later. But you have to set it up in a way whereby people feel totally safe in this process, so that they won't be dominated, they won't be mocked, they won't be shamed in any way, and that everyone is being heard equally and respectfully and stuff like that. And it's very important to set it up in that way where people feel safe to talk. And one of those things is that means we accept all people, but not necessarily all behaviours. But we'll give you a bit more about those parameters later. But as a decision-making tool, it's brilliant, and the key reason is because you own that decision. Everyone's participated in that discussion, and that means you own it and you stand by it. Over to my accomplice here, who's going to talk about...
I'm going to talk about its use in direct action, but I would say also on the subject of using it for decision making, that if you want to start using people's assemblies and using the people's assemblies framework, it's actually very easy and very gentle to decide you're going to hold a people's assembly where you come together to discuss how you might input into the rebellion, or how your local group might take direct action, where what you're actually doing is generating ideas. So there's a really good space for agreement and for ideas to just flow. When you're using it as a decision-making tool, it can sometimes be harder, not harder, but you very often have to hold that space and hold that trust in a more experienced way, and it can be slightly more difficult to facilitate. One of the hardest assemblies I ever facilitated was at Oxford Circus, and it was a decision-making assembly involving all of the affinity groups who'd been holding Oxford Circus, and that was quite hardcore. And if I hadn't have had the experience of facilitating easier assemblies beforehand, I'd have found that really challenging. So using it as a decision-making tool is incredibly powerful, but if that's something that you want to start doing, and I would encourage everybody to start doing that, I would go into that process by organising assemblies around generating ideas first, so that you get an understanding of how that feels and how you hold the space and how you create that feeling of trust and that feeling of inclusivity, possibly before you start to use it for sort of harder decisions along the way, would you say?
Yeah.
Okay. So the other way that you can use assemblies, which is really great, is as a direct action tool. So obviously, we're looking at mobilising through direct action, through non-violent direct action. So there's a couple of ways that assemblies can actually be used in direct action and as a tool for direct action itself. So if you are blocking somewhere, if you've decided you're going to close a road, if you've decided you're going to occupy a building, you can actually use an assembly to hold that space. So say you decide you're going to occupy a museum sponsored by a fossil fuel company, you go in, you occupy that space in the museum, and you actually hold that space by holding an assembly, maybe in that how the museum could divest from the fossil fuel company, or, you know, something else related to that. But you can actually sculpt your action around questions in the assembly directly relating to the space that you're holding. The other way that you can use it is...
It's so nice with the word scarf.
Thank you.
Started.
Did you like that?
Yeah, yeah, it was
Excellent.
fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
That's okay, no, it's fine. So you could use it to, say, block council offices, and you could hold an assembly on how you might move to carbon zero by 2025, or how you could actually, as a community, put pressure on the council to declare a climate emergency. But there's a power in that because you're actually using the assembly to blockade the council offices. The other big advantage of using an assembly as a direct action tool is, depending on where you're doing that direct action, very often you're going to be in direct contact with members of the public. So as there are members of the public around, or council workers, or in the case of when we used it as a direct action during the International Rebellion, we actually had a cordon of police officers as witness to the People's Assembly. What you've then got, and the media, of course, what you've then got is people who are not directly involved with holding that space, who are then witnessing how a People's Assembly works, who are actually standing in and witnessing a group of ordinary people coming together and holding that conversation and listening to each other and hearing each other's viewpoints and co-creating ideas and thoughts and visions around whatever it is that they're discussing. And this can be a really powerful tool for including people, for actually engaging with people, for recruiting people. So very often when, I think particularly during Occupy, when there were people's assemblies going on, there were members of the public who were kind of on the fringes thinking, well, what is this? And you've got that opportunity to say, it's for everybody. You know, we are all crew. Come on in. Your voice matters just as much as everybody in this assembly's voice matters. So it's a way of actually directly engaging members of the public who, when you're holding a space in a direct action, might otherwise feel very much like they are separate to that and not engaged directly into that conversation. When the police came in and took the vote at Oxford Circus, they had a big police cordon around the whole area. Well, they had several police cordons holding people on the inside. And so, of course, the whole area was under a Section 14. So you've got the police cordon line, and then you've got a huge number of activists surrounding that cordon line. You've got a huge number of press within that area, and you've also got a large amount of members of the public, because let's face it, it's the middle of the day in the middle of Oxford Circus. And so using a People's Assembly at that point, which is what we did just outside of the police cordon, you are directly engaging all those people that are holding space in an incredibly non-violent way. So as much as we are all occupying that space in support of the people who are still trying to protect the vote and who are being arrested and who are part of that process, by everybody coming together into a conversation and sitting down, you are modelling a very non-violent form of direct action. So it's still within the area of 14, very visible to the public, to the media, and to the political point was we became very visible in our rebellion as we progressed of the external facing more and more into the public view to support each other in the inevitable grief that that brings. So in front of the line of police, in front of the media, in front of the public, we had a conversation about what it would look like to support each other in this grief. And as a form of direct action, that was a really powerful, moving thing to do. So it doesn't even necessarily have to be an assembly that is framed around what you're doing. You know, we could have done an assembly about how do we escalate the rebellion at that point, or, you know, how do we deal with the eviction process, but instead we chose to do an assembly about supporting each other in grief.
Being creative on that in the moment, being creative about what the assembly is being used for.
Yeah.
Can you imagine the effect that had on, you know, some of the circus we're talking about? These are shoppers suddenly being drawn into a conversation where they're being listened to, and the conversation is about what are you going to do about the fact that climate breakdown is going to completely change the way that this species is living on Earth. That's amazing.
I'm just reading notes that I've covered everything that I was going to talk to you about. Yeah, so obviously in terms of direct action goes back to the decision-making point as well, which Jamie just covered. So, you know, like Jamie said, if you're occupying the road and you've got to a point where the police are coming in and you're not sure what to do, something like that, then you can very quickly hold an assembly just to do a temperature check. So it can be a tool for occupying a space, a tool for engaging the public, a tool for very visibly showing people a form of participatory democracy and how actually all voices could be heard within this process, but also a tool for very quick decision making.
I just thought of a direct action assembly. Is that right?
Yeah, for sure.
Check this out. This is an amazing story, man. I don't think I've told you this. So when Occupy Wall Street was at its height in 2011, there's a very famous big prison in New York called the Boneyard. And there's a great, if you guys don't know, if you, ladies and gentlemen out there, if you don't know a guy called Reverend Billy, I really recommend Reverend Billy, right? He's amazing. Reverend Billy in the Church of Stop Shopping. So he's a really well-seasoned sort of activist, but a sort of performer activist. And he gets arrested all the time. And he was arrested and put in the Boneyard with 3 very young activists, right? 3 young men, and they all got put into the Boneyard downstairs. So there's these 2 holding cells. Billy was in one, and just across the alleyway was another holding cell. And there's like 30 people in each of the holding cells, right? And there's some very, very, very hardcore people in the 2 holding cells, right? And Billy's sitting in one. He's been there hundreds of times. These 3 young people have never been arrested before, yeah? And he hears the 3 young activists going, mic check, and it's basically them starting an assembly, and he's going, oh my God, they're going to get killed. They literally, these young guys are going to get killed. And he was really frightened for them.
Yeah.
And yet they did it so well, and they started an assembly that by the end of it, you had all these, most of the people in there were sort of regular kind of criminal offenders, right? By the end of it, you had these people vocalizing why they feel that the situation they're in is purely because of the circumstances of them being born into inequality, which has led to them being led into a life of crime, and it's purely the fault of the 1%. And they started feeling the ability to articulate why they feel that it was the system that has led to them being in the situation they're in. And it's purely because these 3 young people ran an incredibly well-run assembly. And Billy thought at the beginning, he thought they're going to get killed for doing this. And in fact, by the end, you had all these people saying, I am the 99%, which is incredible. So that's a seriously good example of how these assemblies, if you run them properly, if you facilitate them with no, basically you have to facilitate them with no ego, which is a really handy way to walk around the world anyway, with total humility. So you're totally open to what people have to say. You can actually make the assembly itself a transformative experience for people, you know. And there you are in the Boneyard, a really famous. Anyone who knows New York will know about the Boneyard. It's a really famously hardcore holding police prison holding cell, right? And they had a transformative experience. These people who've been arrested with the 3 young people, they were totally involved. They became members of the 99%, which is extraordinary. So that's another version of using it as a direct action. Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool.
And don't underestimate the power of being listened to. You know, it's very easy to assume that people who are outside of your kind of perception, or outside the activist world, or people who are kind of on the sidelines looking in, are kind of on a different page. But actually most people have not experienced what it feels like to be actually listened to. So when you create a space for that, you often find that people that you wouldn't expect to engage will come in and engage. And if you can create a space where they can feel safe to do that, and that's a really tricky thing. You actually really need to, and we're just going to go on to talk about this, but create something that is radically inclusive, not just for the people who have gathered there with the intention of doing what you are setting up, but also for anybody else, you know. And it could be somebody that is on completely the other side of your awareness, or completely, it could be somebody who's on the other side of this fight for climate justice. And you if you're going to open up that space for all voices, you really have to be prepared to give space for all voices. Otherwise it kind of falls apart.
Yeah, well, that neatly leads into this next section now, which is the 3 pillars. So the 3 pillars are in our opinion, the three main elements, if you can bring all three of these elements into an assembly, it's going to be a good assembly. And so the first one, as Josie just touched on, is radical inclusivity. So that's exactly it. If it's radical inclusivity, you are going to have UKIP voters sitting down with Green voters, etc., etc., etc. People of all shapes, sides, backgrounds, and sort of all political visions. You know, that great phrase that they had in the Occupy movement and the Indignado movement, actually, in Spain, which is leave your banners at the info tent. What that means is you have to arrive completely unbiased, you know, leave your kind of hard-burnt ideologies at the door and be here as a completely open human being, ready to entertain whatever anyone has to say, so that you're open to learn more, all right? And that sort of radical inclusivity, I think, is best summed up by the revolutionaries from Iceland in 2009, when there was the financial crash. The financial crash started in Iceland. And because Iceland, their Houses of Parliament are actually not that big, they were able to surround the Houses of Parliament and cover it in yogurt, sklar yogurt, and egg, right? And they would surround it every day. They just shut down Parliament because, you know, it didn't take that many people to surround it and shut it down. And they started meeting in the squares and using participatory democracy in assemblies, and they were meeting in the coffee houses and discussing what kind of Iceland they'd like to see, you know. And probably a lot of you know that the first thing they decided was, we're going to bang up the bankers, we're not going to bail them out, which has turned out to be a pretty good decision. And they also had pots and pans. It's called the pots and pans revolution. But if you listen to, we worked a lot with the Icelandic pirates, and if you listen to their advice about revolutionary movements, you know, what would you have done differently? One of the things that really struck me was they said, diversity in opinion will pay you back in the long run, socially. You know, if we don't fix this problem to start with, we're simply going to replicate existing power structures. So what they were talking about is, you want to encourage diversity. So to encourage diversity, you have to establish completely radical inclusivity, as in everybody from every different background and from every experience of life has to feel safe and included in this experience. But when you do, it's not just ticking a box. It's not like, okay, we've got a couple of rough sleepers, box ticked. It's actually the bomb. When you have people who have been excluded for so long and you make them completely included, they literally are the bomb. You know, my experience of Occupy London was, you know, you had lots of like highly educated, lefty, Guardian reader, I've got a degree in politics people. And, you know, when they spoke, everyone has the same amount of time. They'd have 2 minutes. You know, the air kind of went, right? And then you'd have Tammy, you know, you're out there, Tammy. You have Tammy, and she took the air, and she was the opposite to highly privileged, you know, degree in politics. She was literally the opposite of that, you know, and in a really beautiful, beautiful way. When she took the mic, man, the air cracked. And that's what was extraordinary about this, is if you're radically inclusive, you're going to get the people who don't take the mic. You're going to get the people who don't usually dominate the conversation. And it's, like I say, it's not just ticking a box. It makes it extraordinary. And it just totally widens our understanding immediately of what we're all facing together. So that radical inclusivity is really, really important. And so how do you establish that? Well, you follow these sort of steps. And you stick to these steps. You know, people need to feel safe in what they're doing. You need to establish right from the beginning, and I'm going to give you a little speech that you read out. It's in the manual, but you need to establish from the beginning the sort of language that makes anybody watching this go, okay, I feel safe to speak. All right, and that's actually quite a hard thing to do. But if you do that, then you're going to actually kind of really turn everything from black and white into technicolor. So radical inclusivity really is at the heart of it. I mean, the way we put it is, you know, effective assemblies achieve radical inclusivity where the emphasis on all being heard and valued equally means no voices are dominating, and the collective wisdom of the assembly can be reached. People can participate safely and openly without fear of judgment or ridicule. Radical inclusivity is a practical step to widening a movement through providing agency to all who participate. So that's the first of the three absolutely major pillars. If you can get all three of these pillars, you've got a great assembly. Over to you.
Okay, so the second of these pillars is active listening. So very often when somebody is speaking, rather than paying all of our attention to what they're actually saying and really trying to understand what it is they're trying to convey, we're formulating our own responses in our mind. This is something that we all do to a greater or lesser extent, whether we're aware of it, unless we have actually really focused on not doing that. So in the manual, it says it's easy to start mapping out in your mind what your response may be while someone is still talking. Active listening is focusing on hearing someone all the way through before developing your responses. Assemblies are not an arena for intellectual jousting or point scoring, but a place that recognises that no one person or group holds all the answers, and that through the wisdom of the crowds we achieve powerful intelligence about the core issues being discussed. Part of what we're doing when we're doing participatory democracy, when we're coming together as a group, when we're organising through Extinction Rebellion, is being aware that the systems and the structures that we've been working with as a community, as a country, as a globe, are not actually serving us. They haven't served us. The power systems, the way that power is held, the way that decisions are made, they haven't worked. They've done us a disservice, and we need to recognise what those systems look like outside, because we need to be able to see how we can actually do things differently, but we also need to recognise how they actually have impacted on us internally. So we need to move from this position of thinking, what's my idea, what's my validation, what's my judgment, how do I input, how do people, do what I think, how do I put my point across. We need to move away from this idea of your own value within that, your own ideas, your own judgments, and that kind of value judgment on us as who we are by whether people agree with us or whether people don't agree with us. We need to move away from the I towards the we, and realise that actually what we need to do is be able to give space for the collective wisdom. And we can input into that, but we can only input into that in a really valuable way if we're able to listen to the collective wisdom, if we're able to hear what other people are saying, if we're able to give space for what other people are saying. Very often within discussions and meetings and organizations, there are certain voices that dominate. There are certain voices that are used to speaking. There are certain voices that are used to holding the agency and used to holding the power. Through active listening, we are challenging ourselves. If we are one of those people who are used to doing that, we're one of those people who feel confident in speaking, who feel confident in inputting. By active listening, we are challenging ourselves to step back and just hear what somebody else is saying. Give that space, give that agency to people that don't have it. And one of the ways that we do that is by using wait. And wait means, why am I talking? So at the beginning of every assembly that we hold, we remind everybody to wait. So just when you think you want to say something, check in with yourself. Why am I talking? Have I got something meaningful to input here? Or am I just responding because that is what I am conditioned to do? And likewise, if you are somebody who is not used to speaking up, if you are somebody whose voice rarely gets heard, if you are somebody who isn't used to having that agency or that the confidence to speak, challenge yourself to step into that place and input, because that's what's missing in most of these conversations. So through actively listening and hearing each other, we can give space for all the different parts of this picture and this puzzle to be inputted in. And through that, we can actually get somewhere. We can move from the I to the we and co-create. So that's active listening.
That's brilliant when you said that. Well done, mate.
I really like active listening. I don't know whether you've noticed, but yeah. I'm really keen on active listening. Yeah. And as a background to this, I'm one of those people. So I really am one of those people. So until not very long ago, you wouldn't have heard my voice until I think the first time I spoke really in public was December. And it was horrendous. I hated it.
Well, when was that? Was that the first?
That was at the talk. No, it was when we did the talk. We held the talk, and I spoke about what we were doing in the local group, and it was horrendous. But I knew that if I really believed in the idea that we were co-creating something, and I knew that if I really believed that all voices need to be heard and be heard equally, if I couldn't use my own voice, how could I ask other people that weren't confident to do that? How could I say to people, you know, we all need to be part of this conversation. We all need to practice radical inclusivity, and we all need to make space for people with no agency to speak. If when I was given that space, I didn't speak. And at one point, when I was asked to speak about something, I said, I can't do that. I think I was asked to speak to the press, and I said, I can't do that. I'm just... And I stopped, and I realized that the next words out of my mouth would define an entire group of people, not just to the person I was speaking to, but in terms of my own understanding of that. So I could have said anything. I could have said, I'm just a mum, or I'm, you know, I'm just, you know, uneducated, or I'm just this, or I'm just that. And I knew that if I define myself like that, then I was stepping right out of radical inclusivity. I was stepping right back into those old systems of who should speak and where the power rests. And I stopped and I said, I'm just scared, because that's the truth.
Yeah,
I was just scared. Yeah.
That's the heart of it to me.
Absolutely.
And I've seen it in practice. I've seen people who are just, it's not me, I'm just a housewife, I'm just, you know.
Yeah.
And I've seen them speak, and I've seen them change everything.
Exactly.
And inversely, I've seen people who are very, very confident, who everyone's not interested in, because they're not. It's not. This is visceral politics. It's connecting here.
Exactly. If it doesn't make it stick to your bones, then you're not connecting. You're not doing it right.
Yeah.
And that brings us on to trust.
So one of the things that was really interesting in putting this package together, you know, in this manual, was talking with the Indignados. So if you want to look up Spain and the 15M movement, or it started off as the Indignados in 2011. So that was the Spanish version of the movement of the squares. And they're amazing people, and that's now transmuted into a really amazing movement called municipalism. The mayor of Barcelona, the mayor of Madrid, etc. We can talk about that another time. But what was really brilliant was I asked them, you know, what was the, you know, one main lesson that you got from it? And Carolina, who does this website called Take the Squares, which I really recommend. I think it's called takethesquares.net. She said, you know what, man, I thought about it a long time. She said, I looked back, you know, and at one time at their height, they were having 80 people's assemblies a week in Madrid alone, right? She said, you know what got me was the trust. The fact that so many, I mean, that's a huge portion of the population, you know, were really involved in this movement that was people-led, you know, as Josie was describing there. It's really important. This is recognizing the fact that the established systems are not capable of dealing what this species needs to move forward to. Yeah, so the established political system, the established forms of democracy, definitely the established economic system, not a chance. If we're going to have a future, it's us. It's here comes everyone, all right? And so the Indignados, or the 15M movement, they were one of the first versions of that, and they were recognizing that. So loads of people got involved in it. And they were having 80 assemblies a week in Madrid. And she said, what struck me was this, man. The trust. Everybody just trusted the process, you know? They weren't challenging it. They were going, look, we're just going to throw everything into this, and we trust the process. We trust it's going to work. And it's a huge ask, isn't it? You know, because we as you were talking, we've been so trained into, you know, our individual version, our individual validation, our individual opinions, all this stuff. And it's actually quite a leap to go, no, I'm just going to trust this process. You know, and if the facilitation has been run in the ways that we're describing, then, you know, trust that process, you know, and actually just let yourself go with it. Like I said earlier, and it's true, you know, 80% of the times I went to an assembly and I knew what we were going to be discussing. I was sure I knew what my opinion would be, but I listened. I trusted the process and I listened. I went through active listening, and I had my mind completely 180 degrees turned around. Because I don't know everything, no one does. It's all about us coming together now and collectively sharing our wisdom, and we've got to do it really quickly. So that's the last of the three pillars, yeah, is to trust the process. Okay, and you know, when you look at the manual and some of the stuff I'm going to say later, obviously, you know, the groups that are involved in organising the assemblies, they're totally accessible. So you can go and challenge stuff, you can go and question people, you can go and find out how to be a facilitator. We're going to send out trainers around the country so that people can get trained. But the actual process itself, the fact of trusting it, right, is a really liberating thing, surprisingly, because it's based in everyone's view, everyone's wisdom, their collective wisdom. It's not trust Fred, it's trust everybody, trust the wisdom of the crowd, yeah? So trust the process. So that's the last of the 3 pillars. I'm aware of the fact it's 20 past, so okay. We're now moving on to how to organise a People's Assembly, young Josie.
Okay, how do you organise a People's Assembly? Well, obviously, if you're organising a People's Assembly as part of a direct action, then you know, where you're doing it is going to be determined by the space that you're holding or how you're organising. But if you're trying to organise an assembly on its own, an assembly is a standalone thing, which I would really recommend you do, then you need to think of various things. So when you're looking at where you're going to hold your assembly, you need to remember radical inclusivity. So if you're looking at a venue, it needs to be wheelchair accessible, it needs to be warm or cool depending on the time of year. You need to think about comfort measures, you need to think about whether you're going to provide food, whether you're going to have what seating you're going to provide. You need to, part of the thing of radical inclusivity and trust is you need to make sure that people feel comfortable and feel able to access that space. You also need to think about childcare. Coming on to that. Okay. Because radical inclusivity and accessibility means that if your assemblies have no provision for people that have children and that need to attend with children, then you are automatically cutting out a huge portion of society, and there's an awful lot of wisdom and an awful lot of juice within, you know, parents, especially when we're looking at what we're facing now. When we're looking at this exercise, you need to make sure you're providing a way for everybody within that society to input into those assemblies. So think about the space that you're holding, think about what you're going to be discussing. If what you're going to be discussing and the way that you're going to be feeding back is not appropriate for children to hear, you need to think about a space that is slightly further away, that people facilitate with activities for children, still close enough for parents to be able to input into the assemblies while still feeling, you know, safe with their children being there. So if you're going to plan assemblies and you're looking at those different things, speak to the people that have needs, speak to the parents. What do you need? What would you need to feel like you could take part in this assembly with your family, with your children? Speak to elderly people. What would you need in terms of comfort measures, provisions, in order for you to be able to feel like you can take part? Think about sound. A huge portion of our population are quite elderly and they cannot hear particularly well. Do you need a PA system? Do you need some kind of amplification to make sure that everybody that's in that assembly is going to be able to hear? So if you're looking at holding an assembly, look at the venue, look at what you're actually going to need, look at how you're publicising it. So make sure that your media and messaging team are on board with trying to get it out, depending on why you're holding it. So if you're just holding it with your local group or a regional group, then obviously publicise it through XR. But if you want to include a wider range of voices, think about how you're actually going to publicise that through newspapers or through local papers, or how you're going to get that message out to a wider group of people that there is a space for them to come and input into this conversation.
One that you might not thought of was you know, a lot of people with disabilities, brilliantly, by the way, it's very, very important to not do any meetings without having complete wheelchair accessibility. But there are a lot of people who are bedbound. So if you have live streamers, so with a lot of live stream, you can have comments going down the side. So people who are bedbound, they can actually still take part in the assembly by putting comments down, and the live streamer will have the opportunity through the facilitator to input your voice from your bed, which is really important as well.
And so then you set your assembly up. When you're actually running the space that you're having the assembly in, make sure that it feels welcoming, make sure it feels accessible. You know, if you're using a venue, make sure that people are actually kind of greeted as they come in, to feel like they can come into that space, to feel like they're welcome. Think about how you're going to set that up so that everybody is included in the conversation. So when you're setting up the room, think about maybe having the, chairs in horseshoe or a circle, at least in the first instance, before you then break out into different groups and different settings. I'm just looking through my checklist. That's about it in terms of organising, isn't it?
Sure. I mean, what we're looking down at is this. So, a lot of the kind of finer details are in that manual, right? It's easy for you to access. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is, how do you actually facilitate a PA, right? So a People's Assembly. So, as Josie's been touching on, the key is inclusivity, all right? So, one of the things you really got to think about is language. And one of the things which we learned to Occupy London really quickly, that there was an amazing moment where a really, really, really well-respected academic intellectual came down and spoke, right? And he was doing a teach out, which I'm going to talk to you about right now, actually. But a teach out is where a sort of expert or someone with a lot of experience in a particular field gives a talk, yeah. And this guy, he started talking and talking, and then eventually someone had their hand up. He'd been talking about 5 minutes, had his hand up, and then he said, "Yeah, what's your question?" And this bloke went, "What the F are you talking about, man?" And it's language. It's language. I mean, come on, we can't use language that excludes huge amounts of people. And the same goes with lots of young people that came down to Occupy London. I remember a 15-year-old came down. He made a vlog the next day, and it was brilliant because he was saying, "I was in breakout groups, and which is part of this, which you're about to hear about. In breakout groups, he's saying, I was with people who could have been my dad, breakout group could have been my grandmother, right? And they were all listening to me, and they were using language I could understand. So that kind of stuff is really important. So how you actually facilitate a PA? You'll find this in the PDF or the book, right? But you need to have two facilitators, male and female, ideally. Or different identities, different gender identities, and again, have a turnover the whole time so that your facilitators are reflective of the diversity in this country, and that's really important to continually do that. Don't have facilitators who are always the same facilitators, so they can end up becoming such a fixture that you're missing the richness of this great society. So always have a wide variety of facilitators, and it's ideally a mixture of different types of genders that are really important. And we've written a kind of basic intro speech which sums up so much, so I'll just quickly read it to you. We value all voices equally in the Assembly, as the aim is to hear the wisdom of the crowds gathered here and not to have the Assembly dominated by individual voices or groups. We recognise that confident speakers are not always right, and that those who are not confident speakers will often have the most useful ideas or opinions to put into the discussion. This is why we value all voices equally, and we ask you to do the same. We do not tolerate any calling out, abuse or shaming, and should conflict arise in this way, there is a conflict resolution in place to resolve this. We welcome all people and all behaviours. So that's a really neat way of opening an assembly. And also what we recommend, and that it's great that people started doing this, by the way, is having a candle or some sort of live flame, and then expressing at the beginning that flame represents the next 7 generations. So we're talking specifically about Extinction Rebellion assemblies here. So obviously that's very key to Extinction Rebellion, is we would like to see a next 7 generations. So we want to have that at the heart of what we're doing, so that when people are making decisions, at the heart of their decisions is that candle, is that flame, is that whatever we decide now, we have to have the consciousness of the dream, the wish, the desire to see 7 more generations, because this is where we are, folks. If you're in Extinction Rebellion and you've been looking at our science, then you know that we're in this extraordinary situation in human history. So you have that candle, you explain what that's about, you've established facilitators, that we've gone through, the facilitators will have gone through how they're going to run the assembly, what we're going to be discussing, how it's going to be run, all that stuff, who's going to be live streaming, how it's been advertised, all of this stuff but now that the assembly is actually ongoing, what we're going to be doing is what are you going to use the assembly for? So you need to think about that. And one of the ways we're using assemblies is decision making, right? So or discussing issues. So one of the things we've been doing, and we experimented with it in the International Rebellion just now in London, was having a teach out followed by an assembly. So a teach out is where you have, best number is 3, to be honest, and you have 3 people who have a lot of experience in a particular field. So on Monday at the International Rebellion, we had alternative economics. So we had 3 people talking about different economic systems that are sustainable economic systems. So you'll have them each speak for 5 to 7 minutes, and you do that first, and then you'll have an assembly afterwards, and the assembly will be discussing what are we going to do about what we've just learned? How do we bring what we've just learned into the movement? Okay, so you can do these teach outs followed by assemblies, and they're really, really powerful, really, really useful. And also you can have people's choice. So people's choice is about the assembly can decide what's the big issue that we want to discuss about today, you know, and as Josie's going to teach you this hand signal stuff, so you can get consensus very quickly. But I've got to say, one of the things that I've found the most powerful moments in people's assemblies is what I call testifying. So you can start assemblies with just say to the gathered people, come to the mic, and you've got 2 minutes, and please always stick to 2 minutes, by the way, folks. If you let someone go on for 4 minutes, then everyone's going to go, but she had 4 minutes, you know, so be really strict about it. Keep to 2 minutes. Exactly. That's the thing. So trust has to be established, and people have to see the trust. So stick to 2 minutes. But basically, you just say, take the mic. You've got 2 minutes. Why are you here? Sounds really simple, folks. But if you're in Extinction Rebellion, I'm telling you now, when people take the mic and they say for 2 minutes, why am I here? It's such a profound experience, because it ends in tears very quickly. Not in tears of depression or misery, just joy and sharing this humanity and feeling okay about sharing this grief. Because I'm telling you now, most of the people, why they're here is very deep human reasons why they're here. It's just strictly just 2 minutes saying that. And that's testify. And it's, you know, if you allow yourself, when you plan your assembly, if you allow yourself half an hour, you will not be disappointed, man. I'm telling you now, it's a really powerful way to start an assembly, and it sets the emotional content. This is not a political movement. This is a movement of what humanity can be. It's a visceral politics. You know, it depends on your definition of politics. Yes, it's a political movement because lots of people are coming together and, you know, deciding stuff. But this is more than just politics as we know it. I'm telling you now. And Testify really shows that fact. So that's, you know, these are some of the keys of how you facilitate an assembly. You know, you stick to that speech that I read out. You stick to the ethos that we've been describing. And you as facilitators, be very, very careful, yeah? If you're going into an assembly and we've got to make a decision about this, yeah? If you're going in and you think you know the answer, don't facilitate, all right? Just don't do it. And the thing is, if you've been facilitating for a long time, you learn not to do that, because you learn that you don't know the answers. I promise you don't. None of you do. None of you do. And the more you become involved in assemblies, the more you realize this. It's us together. Here comes everyone. That's when you start realizing that we've got a chance. That's where you start getting hope. So great facilitators are fully aware of that fact. So you come in open. So that's really how you facilitate an assembly. Do I talk about breakout groups or not? I don't know. I want you to talk about breakout groups. Come on! All right.
Okay, so you gathered your assembly.
You gathered your what? Your assembly. Well, I'm there. Where's the middle of the word?
You've gathered your assembly.
Yeah, that's it.
You've either had a teacher, so you've had experienced people come and talk to you about a particular topic you're going to look at, or you've done people's choice and you've decided on a particular question or a particular area, or you are bringing a particular question to a gathering of people for a specific reason, or you've done testify where you've got everybody fired up. So then what do? Then what you have to do is you have to frame a question. The way that you go into an assembly is you need to have a question, and the question needs to be framed in such a way that it can be discussed and that it can be understood. So again, we're going back to radical inclusivity in the use of language. Do not be framing questions using intellectual language or legalese that some people that are coming into that space won't understand or fully comprehend the meaning. Okay, so you frame a question, and then you're going to ask your gathered assembly to separate themselves into what's called breakout groups. Now, breakout groups, the magic number for breakout groups is about 8 to 10. That's 8. Well done. You can count. You can count on everything. It's brilliant. Okay, so you get everyone to separate out into breakout groups. In every breakout group, you're going to have one facilitator. Now, if you want to start to engage with facilitating assemblies, if you'd like to actually kind of upskill to the point where you're holding assemblies and you have the opportunity to go to an assembly and facilitate in a breakout group, this is a really good way to actually start to understand the process of facilitation. So when we're talking about trust and building trust within the assembly, the way that that trust is built is very much through good facilitation. Good facilitation means, as Jamie was saying before, nobody gets to speak within the assembly or within the testifier for more than 2 minutes. That means that everybody has enough time to speak, but not to dominate. So as a facilitator, you really have to watch for people who are used to having their voices heard going on and on and on. You have to really bring it in so that all voices get heard for no more than 2 minutes. That's one way that you establish trust. Another way that you establish trust and another way that you facilitate the conversation is through the use of hand signals. So within your group, you have one facilitator whose job is to keep the conversation moving. And the way that that works is through the use of hand signals, which I'm going to show you in a second. And the other job within that breakout group is the note taker. So the note taker's job is to make note of all the points that are raised in the breakout group that achieve consensus, of all the points that people like. So every time someone suggests something, every time somebody mentions something, and through the show of hands, which I'm going to explain to you in a minute, the note taker watches and can see the points that people really agree with, the points that have got a lot of energy, the points that have got a lot of agreement, a lot of consensus.
Everyone goes like that.
Because everyone goes like this. And they make note of it. At the end of the assembly, all of the note takers of the breakout groups will come together and feed back all of the notes, or if it's a very big assembly, then just a few of the notes to the rest of the assembly. And then you'll have an overall note taker that will do exactly the same thing. They'll watch for the whole assembly to see, by a show of hands, which of those ideas gets the most excitement, the most enthusiasm, the most consensus from the assembly. And they will make notes from the overall assembly. Okay, so the way that we keep that conversation moving, the way that we ensure that every voice is heard, the way that we ensure that people are actively listening and not talking over each other, is through the use of hand signals. So within the breakout groups, if you want to speak, you raise a finger. If you're facilitating, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Did you want to speak, or are you just modelling?
I'm just modelling.
Okay, great. So if you're a facilitator, what your job is to do within that context is to watch for the fingers that go up and to keep an eye on the order that they have gone up so that you're giving everybody a chance in turn to speak. There are some exceptions to this though, and this again is about amplifying voices that don't get to speak very often and giving agency to places where there's not agency, you know, within the systems that we're working in. So what your job as a facilitator is to watch for the order that those fingers go up, to make sure that nobody speaks for more than 2 minutes. But if somebody that hasn't spoken or hasn't spoken very much puts their finger up, they jump the stack. So if there's fingers up who have been inputting into that conversation all the way along, and then the quiet person in the corner puts their finger up, they go first. They jump the stack. You give them the agency that they're suddenly stepping into. Right, yeah, your voice. We haven't heard your voice. And there's a skill in that, just keeping an eye and being aware of who's speaking a lot, who's not speaking very much, and how to make sure everybody gets a chance to speak and be listened to. So there's one finger. There's also a direct point. Now, direct point is a little bit of a tricky one because what can often happen if you are an inexperienced facilitator, if you don't feel confident in facilitating, is the people that are used to having their voice heard and used to inputting can often abuse the direct point. So what a direct point is if someone has said something and you have a piece of information that directly informs what they're asking or what they're inputting that they are not aware of, you can put 2 fingers up because you have an unknown piece of information that can help to inform what they're talking about or the question that they're asking. You can help to clarify something to them. If you put your fingers up for a direct point, the facilitator can offer you a chance to say what it is that you need to say. This is not a time for you to add your comment. This is not a time for a response to what somebody is saying. This is purely if you have a piece of additional information. So if you make a direct point, you can add that piece of additional information and then you go back to your place within the group. And if you want to make a comment, if you want to have a response, if you want to, if you want to put your own input in, then you need to put your finger up. As a facilitator, you need to really make sure that people don't abuse the direct point, because it's a really easy way for people to go, oh, yeah, but I have something that relates perfectly to that. And it is, I oppose what you're saying. Or I have a different view on that. Yeah, but that's not a direct point.
Can you give us an example of a direct point, please, Josie?
Okay, so an example of direct point would be, say, somebody is saying, somebody's put their finger up. I'd really like to learn an awful lot more about people's assemblies, and I'm wondering if there's some way in which we as a group could try to gain more information about people's assemblies. There's no. Yes.
There's a training in direct assembly in people's assemblies at 2 o'clock today.
Thank you very much for that information, Jamie. That was a direct point.
It's a direct
and then we carry on back into the stack. So I would like to speak. Direct point. If someone says something and you agree with it, reveille. Please, as a facilitator, make sure that people are using shaky hands, because this is how the note taker gauges the temperature check, gauges the consensus of the group. This is how the assembly works. So very often people are so focused on how we're having this discussion that they forget that they actually need to show consensus really by this. The other reason that we use this is because when someone's saying something that we agree with, within the society and the discussions and the way that we converse within what's come to be normal, we talk over them. So someone makes a point you really like and you go, wow, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I really agree with that. And I think, so by showing consensus, by shaking hands, we're not interrupting people. We're not overriding what they're saying. We're allowing them to be actively listened to. We're allowing just their voice to input at that time. The other thing it does is, particularly for people that are not confident speaking, if you're saying something, you don't feel super confident in using your voice to do that, and you look up and you see a sea of hands, it's like, oh my God, these people actually get it. I'm being listened to, and not only that, but I'm being understood. This is amazing. Okay, those are the main hand signals. There's also clarification. So as Jamie was saying, about people using language that you don't understand, about people maybe not being succinct in what they're saying, the really simple hand signal is just that. What that means is, I don't get what you're saying. You need to reframe it. You need to reword it. You need to add some additional information. So if someone's saying you don't understand, clarification. You don't even necessarily need to ask that person what they want clarification about. You can just try to explain what you're saying in a different way, or the facilitator can say, what would you like clarification on? Okay, direct point.
Yeah, direct point on that is, we were doing an assembly training recently, and a woman from Latin America was really pushing on this in particular. She was saying, I'm from Latin America, 50% of the language you're using, so it's really important to, the radical inclusivity doesn't extend to just people from the UK, all right? So that actually is very, very valuable. This is a global movement, so language is going to be a serious problem at times. So always look out for that C. And that C, if you're, put it the other way around, if you're from Venezuela and English is not your first language and you're at a people's assembly, don't feel shy about going like that, all right? You have to bring everyone on board.
Okay, so the other one that we use is this. And this is rounding up. So as a facilitator, if you are making sure that nobody gets to talk for more than 2 minutes and somebody is approaching that 2-minute time, you need to just ask them to round up. And you need to make this really clear from the start that this is what rounding up is. In Occupy, they used to do this, and it was considered that perhaps that's a little bit like rushing somebody. So we like the just rounding up, and use it. If you're facilitating, you have to use it. You have to make sure that people don't get to dominate that conversation. So rounding up is a really nice, gentle way to say, you need to bring this to a close now. And the only other one that we use is a technical point. Technical point is, the building is on fire. I really think we need to do something about that. Or the police are surrounding us and have said they're going to arrest everybody that is within this area if we don't move right now. So anybody who doesn't want to be arrested needs to leave the assembly. Technical point is just that, a technical point. So it's not to add information about what you're discussing, it's about something else is going on that everyone needs to be aware of right now. And those are the hand signals. So that's how the facilitator helps keep the discussion moving. Everybody has to respect the hand signals. Everybody has to ask to speak in turn. Everybody has a maximum of 2 minutes. At the end of an agreed discussion time, the note taker will have made notes. You need to make sure, if you're facilitating the whole assembly, that you tell everybody in 5 minutes time, we are going to ask the note taker to take 5 or 10 minutes to feed back what they have captured as the feeling from the breakout group, to make sure that they have captured that feeling accurately. So give people notice that you're going to bring that discussion time to a close, and then ask them to stop the discussion and ask the note takers in each group to feed back what they captured, to make sure that the group feels that that is an accurate representation. And from that, the note taker can condense that down with the group to maybe a couple of points, depending on how many groups you had, depending on what level of input you're looking for. During the International Rebellion, because time was quite tight and we were working with some seriously large crowds, we honed it right down to getting the note takers to feedback essentially one sentence, 1 point, which was the one that got the most consensus, which seems tricky, but was a really good way of kind of focusing people on what they all felt, like what that collective decision was. So the note takers feedback to the group, they get their point or points. You bring the breakout groups all back into the assembly as a whole, and then the note takers come up to the front or stand up where they are, however you want to do it, and they go through that feeding back process. So they then read out what was generated in their breakout group. You have an overall assembly note taker, and the overall note taker makes a note in the same way that the breakout group note takers did of the ideas that got the most consensus in the whole assembly.
Overall voice of the assembly.
Yeah, exactly. Collective wisdom.
Okay, so to carry on from there, because we're conscious of time, we've got 15 minutes left, and thanks for everyone who's writing their little comments there and stuff, and hope it's been going all right for you guys. But so where does it go? What's the point of it? It's very important that you don't do assemblies in your regional groups. Everyone gets deeply involved in it, you know, and then where does that go? It's really important to actually make this go somewhere. The whole idea of this is that people own this conversation, they own the decisions that we all made, and they see them acted upon. So we're talking about this in the context of Extinction Rebellion, which is, you know, we're in 43 countries, over 100,000 members globally, 30,000 people joined just during the 10 days of the International Rebellion that we just did. So it's a really huge thing. How does everyone engage? You know, how do all our ideas feed in? So Josie was just talking about the overall note taker. That means when all the note takers come up, and by the way, two lines that you'll get used to if you get into assemblies. The first line is this, right? You've taught everyone how to do breakout groups. You've taught everyone about this, right? And I'll tell you one line you're going to do now is once all the breakout groups have started happening, and believe me, people really want to speak and be heard, and they really want to listen to each other. People, they're like piranhas on a piece of meat as soon as they finally were able to talk to each other. It's the strangest thing, you know? It's just people talking with each other. It's not rocket science, but actually it's hardly here anymore. Face to face, kind of debate with strangers and discussion with the strangers. It's really intoxicating and really powerful. But one of the first lines you're going to be using straight away is, oh, it's after 5 minutes of breakout groups, you walk around and you go, oh, it looks like no one is agreeing with anything that anyone is saying, because everyone forgets to do that. So you remind them to do that. And the other line you're going to find yourself saying is, or you're going to find yourself hearing, is the note takers in the breakout groups
they often haven't made the connection to the fact that they are eventually going to have to come up in front of the assembly and read back the notes, you know. So often they go, I didn't realise I was going to have to read back. But actually, it's a great experience for them because they actually go, wow, that was great. It was, I've never spoken in front of a crowd before, and it actually felt really good. So those are two things that are going to happen quite a lot. But you've got your overall note taker. So if it's big decisions about the movement as a whole, if it's like you know, over the International Rebellion that we just had, you know, should we leave the camps? You know, so assemblies started happening about that. So you've got your overall note taker who will take the main ideas that come back from the whole assembly. That means your individual note takers say stuff, and if the whole assembly goes Revolution, Forest of Hands, then that's a really important thing. That's like a, you know, close to consensus. That's a very popular thing that just got said, and then that can get fed time out. Yeah, technical point.
Technical point is that actually we are running out of time for questions and answers.
I know.
I think we'll be all right, but I was just pointing out that we have.
Let's take 2 minutes for me to finish talking, and then we'll go to
cover that bit,
right,
and then
okay,
we'll go to
cool.
Q&A.
Right. So they have to go somewhere, these things. So that the overall note taker, if there's a major decision being made by the movement, those overall notes will be going into the central movement, and that means that all decisions are being made. All of these assemblies around the regional groups, this has been taken into account. All right, this is the system that we're working at the moment, right? But also, you can use citizens.is, which is the Icelandic site that we've been using. That was the Icelandic site that was used to crowdsource the constitution in Iceland. That's a really good place where you can put all the ideas that come from an assembly, and it's very easy for people to upvote and downvote, so you can see an immediate response to the ideas that come out. But they need to be going up online or on Facebook, if you've got your own Facebook group, so that everyone can see what the groups have been discussing, so they can be involved in it. Yeah.
There's also on our website rebellion.assemblies, then you can find details of assemblies that have already happened and see what's been inputted there, and that's a place that we can also input like larger assemblies that relate to kind of national level stuff into there as well. You can see that there.
Yeah, cool, thanks. Okay, so with 1 minute left to go before Q&A, so there's only going to be 10 minutes of Q&A, I'm afraid. Okay, what should they be about? So are you going to talk about that? Yeah. Talk about regionals, and then I'll talk about the post-carbon.
Okay, so what can your assemblies be about? It completely depends on why you're holding an assembly. So as we talked about using them as a direct action, then they can be about something that directly relates to the action that you're carrying out. But if you're using them in your local groups or you're using them in regional groups, then they can impact, you can talk about how you impact locally, talk about how you organise locally, talk about how you further the rebellion, talk about how you input into the rebellion from your local group. But you can also talk about how you act globally. So you can hold assemblies within your local group on how you can start to look at how you are supporting the global south, how you are, you know, how you're thinking about what you're doing across a global platform. So it doesn't just have to be things that are relating directly to what you're doing in your local group. Where else my notes? Yeah, so in terms of what they can be about, they can be used in different ways, and again, like we were saying about feeding into national strategies and feeding into the national conversations and the international conversations, we need to have input coming in and input going out, and be aware of the fact that even if we're holding a local assembly, that we can be discussing how we actually come to bring climate justice for the global south into our awareness within our local groups. They don't have to be specifically locally focused questions.
And then there's level 2, folks, and level 2 is really worth treating very carefully and being very slow to approach to it for a very good reason. So level 2 of assemblies, and this is just now emerging out of the movement. But level 2, can you imagine this? Can you imagine holding assembly, and the assembly is on what do we do when food prices triple overnight? What do we do if the ATMs run out of cash? What do we do if hospitals run out of medicine? So what we're talking about here is, you know, I'm sure many of you in Extinction Rebellion, you've looked at Jem Bendel's deep adaptation paper, all right, deep adaptation. It's really worth looking at. We are beginning to tell the truth. This movement has really pushed for telling the truth. climate breakdown is far, far more serious than our governments or our mainstream media have been revealing. And so we do have to deal with the fact that very possibly there's going to be a breakdown in the food distribution network in the next 2 or 3 years. There's going to be all kinds of breakdowns. It's very, very possible. We're not, you know, we're not scaremongering or anything like that. It's very, very possible that there are going to be these very serious consequences of climate breakdown not being addressed. So if you are going to start holding assemblies around these kind of topics, what do we do if food triples in price overnight? What do we do if the ATMs run out of cash? You can't do those kinds of assemblies unless you pay a lot of attention to holding people's grief. It's the emotional spin cycle. If people are being introduced for the first time to the severe consequences of climate breakdown, that's an emotional spin cycle. You can't just leave members of the public who've just rocked up. You can't leave them completely wrecked. So you need to put into place something like what they've got in Frome. In Frome, they've got an Extinction Cafe, right? So what that is a place where people can go and they can share their grief. They can talk about what it feels like to be dealing with the fact that millions of species are looking like they're going to get wiped out. The biodiversity truly is collapsing, that the polar caps truly are melting. You know, this is the reality that the human species is facing. So you can't hold assemblies that kind of just blasé open up that subject without any protection to hold strangers who've rocked up. You need to be able to hold their grief and deal with that thing. So that's the sort of level 2 sort of subjects that you can look at with people's assemblies further down the line. Do look at the Extinction Cafe setup that they've got in Frome. They're making a film about that at the moment so that more people in the rebellion can actually kind of get to grips with how to deal with that. So that sort of brings us to the end of our webinar. We thought it actually would take an hour, but we kind of enjoyed ourselves doing it. I did anyway. I don't know about you. That's all right. Yeah. So we've got about 7 minutes left.
I think we can probably overrun a little bit. I don't think we've got any other webinars booked onto this, so I think we'll probably be all right to overrun a little bit. But shall we do some question and answers?
Yeah, okay. Definitely. So if anyone wants to write up a question there, please, folks, let's go for it.
Okay, so are there any videos of an actual assembly from start to finish?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There are. There's a video of a people's assembly that we did on Westminster Bridge during Rebellion Day 1, and it's a live stream done by John Phoenix. What's it called? Is it Global? What's his website?
Phoenix.
Yeah, something like Global Solutions. You can find that. And there are bits, but no one has actually filmed. And during the International Rebellion that we just had, there was actually quite a lot of bits, good ones that were filmed. And we're looking at one coming out quite soon that may be what you're saying, which is from beginning to end. But yeah, we're still not. This is the first time a proper webinar has been done about it, for example. So it's still quite new. Yeah.
I believe that during the International Rebellion, there was quite a lot of live streaming done of some of the assemblies that were held at Oxford Circus, and I believe that live streaming was done by the Bristol Extinction Rebellion crew. And so I think if you go onto the Bristol Extinction Rebellion page, there's quite a lot of live streaming clips, and I think you can actually get the whole of an assembly from start to finish over 2 sections on there, because they did quite a lot of it. But in terms of filming and in terms of live streaming, there's quite a lot of just groups of people engaged in talking to each other. So when you've got about half an hour of that, very often people switch off and then start it up again when it gets to the notes being read back. But if you want to see an example of that was done over the International Rebellion, then Bristol Extinction Rebellion page videos have got quite a lot of live streaming of how it was all set up.
Good. Yeah, that's a useful question. What else have we got?
Okay. Is it a good idea to include people that want to pull down and or undermine the assembly? How is that managed? That is a brilliant question.
So it goes back to that's. I mean, you know, we a lot of these lessons were learned by you know, coming up with serious obstacles. So that's why that line is really underlined in this manual and over this webinar we've just given, is we accept all people but not all behaviours. So that if there are, and we go into it more in the manual, right, but if there are behaviours that are negative to the overall experience and safety, you know, that threaten the vulnerability of people who may be in the assembly, then those behaviours will be excluded. So you know, that's underlined it completely there. It's people who are there to undermine the assembly, well, that's a behaviour that won't be accepted. You know? And there's very few behaviours that won't be accepted. You know, obviously things like drink and drugs, like we had at Marble Arch and Oxford Circus, in fact, the whole International Rebellion. You know, the idea of people kind of going down there and getting drunk or anything like that, you know, that's, you know, you can do that any time in your life. It's just not acceptable behaviour there. Well, what did I say?
You said the idea of like drinking drugs like we had at Marble Arch.
Oh, well, the idea of it being excluded. Yeah, excluded. Sorry. All right, so include people. Yeah, what's that one? Take a question from the Zoom chat also, not just Facebook.
We're only taking questions. It did say in the event that we are only taking questions from the Zoom webinar chat. Okay. So we are currently, all we have is the webinar chat. I know that the Facebook live stream is going on, but it did say on the event that although it would be live streamed, we would only be able to take questions from the Zoom chat. So that's all we're doing.
If there's any questions on the Facebook that you want to put onto the Zoom chat, go for it.
We can't see it.
We can't see it, basically.
No. And the other thing about people that want to pull down or undermine the assembly is they can have their 2 minutes. You know, yeah, they can have 2 minutes to say why they feel like that, and then everybody can actually discuss it. You know, everybody gets their 2 minutes.
Yeah, that's a really good solution. Can you please say something about the decision making via people's assemblies and responsibility for actions on those decisions?
So, you mean in terms of you hold an assembly to make a decision, and then the responsibility for actions on those decisions? So I guess...
From the point of view of someone who's running a regional group. So yeah. You've held an assembly, there's a decision made, take it from there.
So I've held an assembly, I've brought people together, we've made a decision on a particular aspect of what we're doing or on something, and then if the assembly makes the decision, and if you've brought the assembly together, then you have to respect the decisions of the assembly. It might not be what you wanted to come out of that assembly.
Yeah, fair point. But also, you know, just to underline what we were saying earlier, was the thing is, you know, this is an Extinction Rebellion assembly that you're holding. You've got a regional group that have all been involved in doing the assembly. And if you've run the assembly, you've facilitated it well, everyone has taken part in that decision. So they literally own it. You will all go away going, I was part of that decision. So you own it. So it's a really empowering situation, rather than, you know, a leader saying, we're all going to do this tomorrow. You know, that doesn't empower you in the same way at all. So yeah, as Josie's saying, you know, if you hold an assembly and a decision is made and everyone was involved in it, then yeah, of course you carry on with it. Otherwise, what's the point of the decision?
If you can. I mean, obviously, if you are the person that has to implement that decision and it's not feasibly possible to implement that decision, then, you know, then you kind of have to take it back to the assembly afterwards and say, hey, look, you know, we came to this decision, but as we've gone forward and tried to do that, you know, just because the group that has gathered has decided that they're going to do something, you know, if it becomes dangerous or difficult or inappropriate or other information comes to light, then obviously you have to take it back to the assembly. You have to treat that with you know, sense.
Yeah, that's a good point. And what this person's added is there can be a gap between decisions made by large groups and actions of the few. So that's why these are really powerful, is that these are decisions made by a large group. Okay, this is not like 3 leaders in a room saying we're all going to do this. What it is a large group. So, you know, as I've just said, you know, we've all taken part in this decision. We all own it, so we all go forward with it together. Any idea about sizes of citizens' assemblies? So if you mean citizens' assemblies, the kind of ideal number is 100. So it was 100 in Dublin when they did the assembly about abortion. If you've just come on, by the way, do watch that film. It's called When Citizens Assemble. And it's really, really good kind of introduction. It's only 14 minutes long. It's a brilliant introduction to what citizens' assemblies are about. But if you're talking about citizens' assemblies, yeah, it's about 100. If you're talking about people's assemblies, you know, the one we did in Parliament Square on April the 15th, about 1,500 people, you reckon? Yeah, about 1,500 people, which is pretty. So that means when the note takers are feeding back, they went on quite a long time. But usually assemblies that we've been involved in about 100 to 150 to 200. You know, when we do regional assemblies down here, about 50 to 70.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
What have we got there? What's that one? What happens?
What happens if what is decided by the assembly is legal? Well, then you kind of have to take a decision on what it is you're discussing as an assembly and what you're going to do about it. I mean, if you're discussing a direct action, which is going to have, you know, the consequences of it being an arrestable action, and that's a decision that is made by the people who are actually going to undertake that action, then that's completely up to them. I mean, I guess if you're asking, you know, is it legally binding if the assembly decides that you're going to do something that is illegal for a particular group, or then no, it has to be, you're creating it yourself. I think you have to apply the same decision-making processes to that as you would to your own activities. So as an assembly, if you're talking about going out and doing an illegal action, then you're speaking for yourself and the group in that assembly. But when it comes to doing it, obviously, you know, it's personal choice if you're going to do something illegal or not.
Yeah, no, good answer. But also bear in mind this Extinction Rebellion, which is at the heart of it, is non-violent, mass civil disobedience. So those kind of decisions are going to come out of the assembly quite a lot. You know, if you know, there is a sort of precedent for what's it called, conspiracy. So people being arrested for conspiring to break the law. But the fact is, what are you going to do? You're going to arrest an assembly. You know, that's another aspect of this decision-making process. I had a question above you missed. What do you think about using PAs in the information sharing format to build support for CAs? Well, we've done that. That's an excellent question. Thanks. Yeah. So what we did, what I'd recommend is what we did at the International Rebellion. So we did a day where we had teach-outs about alternative democracies that were followed by assemblies. So what we had was a number of experts on citizens' assemblies. 3 is the best number, by the way. And each of them would speak for 7 minutes about a different aspect of citizens' assemblies. And then we'd have a people's assembly about how you will implement citizens' assemblies, or how you will push to raise awareness about citizens' assemblies. So what you have is people who are experts talking about citizens' assemblies, and then the people's assembly talking about how we're going to promote that whole idea. What's happening? These millions of questions come in at the same time.
Okay, so the question, hang on a second. I just got to go back up a second. Can everybody just hold fire on the questions just for a second? Okay, so that was great. So Sophie had a question above that you missed, so I'm assuming we're going to find that in a second. So Renee says the assembly holds no responsibility at all. What about safeguarding, etc.? You asked about the decisions of the assembly being illegal. So obviously everybody that participates in an assembly is doing that of their own free will. So they're coming together to have a conversation around an agreed topic and or an agreed decision-making process. So in terms of the assembly holding responsibility, you are all part of that process. That's the entire point. You all hold responsibility. So in terms of safeguarding, if you're organising assembly, then yes, of course, you know, normal safeguarding practices apply. So like I said, in terms of, are there going to be children? Are there going to be other people who are witnessing what's being said? What provisions are you going to make for, as Jamie was saying, for the impact of what you're discussing, the appropriateness of what you're discussing, for, you know, from a regenerative culture point of view. But in terms of decision making, and in terms of the Assembly's responsibility for what comes out of it, you're all co-creating that. Nobody's in charge. So you're bringing people together, you're inviting people together to come and talk. And just as you are not in any way in charge of what comes out of it, in terms of you're not holding power in terms of what the decisions and what the ideas and what the flow of information is, you don't have an overall responsibility for that, in the sense that you're all creating it together. Is that fair enough comment?
Yeah, no, totally. No, that's a really good answer. 6 new messages.
Okay, hang on.
should put a time limit on it. It's just going to go, wow.
We can have no more questions for a second. I'll see how we go. Is there a framework around confidentiality of what is shared in the People's Assembly? I think.
Well, I guess you'd use common sense, really. I mean, there's obvious things. I suppose, in a way, assemblies, People's Assemblies have got the same as GDPR, isn't it? Which is, you know, we're always going to have to be careful about personal details that you give out. All right, you can't guarantee that you know everyone who's going to be in the assembly. If you know about the way that police liaison officers operate, for example, they're intelligence gatherers. So it's important not to be free and easy with sharing your own personal information. You make that judgment yourself. But also, I guess, in terms of the confidentiality of who's doing what, I mean, this is an extremely open movement. We take responsibility for everything that we do, and we're willing to take the consequences of what we do. So I guess, in a way, you know, the confidentiality, just be sensible, just use common sense about being confidential about your own personal private life. You don't give out information about your own personal private life, and you don't give out information about the personal private life of other people in the groups, because you don't know who you're talking to. But in terms of what we're going to do as a movement, we're very, very, very open about
it. Would like more info on conflict resolution or what to do if people are hurt and offended. I did see this, and it was posted before we started the questions and answers, and I believe that somebody put a link underneath it to a conflict resolution process. I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, you can find the conflict resolution processes on the website quite easily, and through the regenerative culture sections as well. There's lots about conflict resolution. But you know,
in terms of actually if there is conflict during an assembly.
Yeah, right. That's a really good point. So look, I mean, can you answer that, because you're running a really good regional group, and you've got a regen culture gang, right? Yeah.
So one of the things in terms of in that assembly framework, if you are holding an assembly, then it's really good to have regen people, so regenerative culture people who are engaged, like Jamie was saying about being aware of feelings that might come up during the assembly. So at the beginning of every meeting and every assembly that we hold, the first thing that we do is we introduce the regen people that are in the group. So we get everybody that's part of the regen group to stand up, and everybody identifies a regen person in the room. And if at any point they feel uncomfortable, if at any point they feel like they need some support, they feel hurt, they feel anything that they don't feel comfortable with, they can go immediately to those people. And we've had that happen in nearly every meeting that we've held at some point, whether it actually be just a physical discomfort or somebody feeling very overwhelmed, then they've gone to an identified regen person. If you're talking about the communication, then again, within the framework of not using offensive language, not belittling, not calling people out, if somebody is doing that, then the facilitator needs to actually name that.
Yeah.
They would say, I'm really sorry, but, or not even I'm really sorry. What you are actually doing is belittling, and, you know, and this is not okay, please stop doing this. What you are doing is calling out, or the way that you are addressing this person is ableist or sexist. Or so as a facilitator or another member of the group, because it's really explicit that those things are not acceptable within the context of an assembly, then you can actually name that within that group. You can name that within that process. And if that person doesn't stop doing that, you can actually ask them to leave.
Yeah, and it goes more than that, because once you get into the process of doing this, and once you have like a good body of facilitators who kind of turn over the whole time, this becomes embedded in your culture, your revolutionary culture, which means that it's not just the facilitator who will call that person out. It will be everybody. And that's when things get really expedient and really sort of, we can hold everybody, when everybody will stand up against a behavior that's unacceptable. So it's not just the facilitator's job. Eventually, when you get this culture working really richly, everybody will identify behaviours that will not be tolerated, and then we'll all stand up together against racism, ableism, etc.
Okay, so we've got love the way of working and letting go to let the people decide. Trusting the people won't lead to the citizens of Weimar Germany to exterminate a minority group.
I know, I'm concerned. But obviously, there's no Goebbels, there's no Hitler. This is literally the voice of the people. There's no agenda behind it. So, you know, this is not Weimar Germany.
And it's also about trust. You know, we have got to trust that when you give space for these conversations, when you give people an equal voice, that people can communicate and that people can arrive at decisions together. So this is about disseminating power and disseminating agency through everybody. Okay, so let's go down here. I think we just have to do a couple more. I've actually paused the chat because we were losing questions. Okay, that's a response to someone else. Oh God. Okay, that's I would like. Yeah, no, that's been done.
We will. Thank you very much. You too.
Okay.
That's kind of it, right?
I think that is probably. I reckon if there's any, I reckon we do like maybe. What time is it?
8:10.
Is it already? Okay. I reckon we can.
Very informative webinar. Thank you for listening.
I reckon we can round that up.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
We'll round that.
Let's round that.
Let's round that.
Okay.
Right.
So I think that this is going to be. So this has been recorded. As far as I know, it will be available to watch again. I would imagine a link to it will probably go jazz hands.
You're saying that?
That's what I'm saying, jazz hands. I love it. Writing jazz hands is brilliant. We need jazz hands, emoji thing.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you. How can you be contacted? Okay, so there's the live stream on Facebook. So obviously we'll look through that and look through the questions on that. If you look at the events page that's on Facebook that you would have all linked through, hopefully, to get to this webinar, there is a Google Docs sign up for anybody that wants to become more involved with running people's assemblies. So if you want to start to kind of get involved with the seeding of people's assemblies, then please put all your details into that sign up, whatever your level of experience. It's quite a detailed form, so you can enter into that at any level and we will contact you, basically. So thank you.
Yeah.
And I think I've put a link to the manual PDF in the Facebook event, which I will check in a minute. And if I haven't done, I will do.
Hey, James Lander. Yeah, much love to you too. And Claire Van Ryn, thank you. And Cam Smith, thank you.
Thank you, guys. Look, take it out. Talk to people, start to have conversations, introduce hand signals, introduce this way of working into your local groups, into your conversations, introduce the idea of deliberative democracy, introduce the idea of participation into your local groups, into how you're structuring, and and get in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Keep it lit. You're total diamonds.